Today, we are super happy to have Professor Ruth Aylett with us from Heriot-Watt University. Ruth is a professor of computer science, where she specializes in affective and social computing and human-robot interaction. Ruth describes herself in a way that I really find interesting as a British author, computer scientist, poet, and political activist. And now you might think, how can everyone have so many good qualities at the same time? And today we can hopefully have a glimpse of that in Ruth's talk. So we will be listening to the presentation of the freshly new baked book called Living in Robots, What Every Anxious Human Needs to Know. We will link in the chat the book in case everyone wants to acquire it after. And it was also written with Professor Patricia Vargas, also an Heriot-Watt professor. So this book gives us an overview of the state of robotics in society today, but I will actually not say more, as I will just hand it to Ruth to start sharing more about the work and the book in itself. So Ruth, you can share your screen and start your talk.
Hi everyone, I hope you can hear me. My internet connection is not perfect today. If I cut out, I'm very sorry. Nothing much I can do about it. So, living with robots. Well, this is what the book looks like. It's MIT Press and Penguin Random in the UK. You could get one everywhere people buy books as a result, so it's widely distributed. But I suppose the question to ask is, why am I talking about a popular science book when I'm talking to roboticists? Because you know all this stuff. Yeah, you don't have to read the book to learn about robots. As we established earlier, you're not particularly anxious because, like me, you understand the limitations of robotics. So why am I talking to you? Well, I'm talking to you because essentially the book is responding to robot hype. That's why we wrote it. We got more and more upset about some of the stuff, which I'm going to repeat incidentally, for your edification, that was being cited for robotics. So I'm going to say what the hype is. I'm going to talk a little bit about why people believe it. They do widely, not if you're in robotics, but disturbingly not just the general public, but even quite a lot of what I call other professions, who you would think would be slightly less prone to it, philosophers, lawyers, people in some other science fields. Stephen Hawking believed it about AI. You know, people who are quite mature researchers, just not in this field, believe it. So that is kind of odd. I'll talk about why I think people believe it and how we should respond. We are a community, and I'll talk about what I think we should do about it. Well, other than writing a book, which of course is what I've done. So hype. Well, Gartner in 2014 produced this rather pretty diagram, which probably has type that's rather small on it for a lot of you, which gives the structure of technology hypes. Now, most of you are quite young, and you may not have experienced very many hypes. This may be the first hype you've experienced, for all I know. Let me say that if you've been around for longer, then you notice that these things come along every few years in different fields. So the first hype I remember was expert systems from the 1980s. And I only tend to remember the hypes in my own field. So there are other technology hypes in fields I don't work in. Neural nets came round, I think in the third hype of neural nets at the moment, in the form of deep learning. This diagram shows that, well, as Gartner thought there was an innovation trigger, expectations get higher and higher and higher and higher until they become thoroughly implausible. In other words, out of step completely with what the technology can deliver. Then there's a trough of disillusionment when everyone goes, oh, it's crap, isn't it? It doesn't do anything. And then a slow rise of enlightenment where people begin to recognize that there are some good things this technology can do. And then hopefully you get to the plateau of productivity on the right-hand edge of the diagram, where people start doing the useful things with the technology. In 2014, Gartner had smart robots, and I don't know if you can actually see my mouse, but if you can't, it's about halfway up the upslope of innovation trigger. I'm not convinced about the innovation trigger, by the way. I don't see any specific innovation trigger that has made robots become a hype topic. It seems to be kind of accidental in a lot of cases. Over the top, they've got big data, which may have looked as if it was fading away in 2014, but I think they have it on the wrong side of the curve because it's still way, way up at the top. What else have we got there? Cryptocurrencies has just come over the top. Again, I think they got that wrong. That's still being hyped. Consumer 3D printing. I would say also, I think autonomous vehicles have just gone over the top of the hype. I think they're going to drop into the trough of disillusionment now. Further down, we've got gamification, still popular but not hyped. As you go right down the bottom, you get virtual reality, which I have worked in. I've been through, again, I think it's about 3 virtual reality hypes. The first one of those that I remember was in the late 80s, early 90s. And I think there've been a couple since. So robots are in there, maybe not with an innovation trigger. At some point, they will crash into the trough of disillusionment. That's how it goes. Like all crashes, you don't expect it until it happens. Unfortunate if you have to live through it. So you may hear older researchers talking about the AI winter. That was the crash after the 80s hype of AI. I think we're heading for another one with machine learning, personally. But there you go. That's how it is. So that's what I'm talking about. The result is you get stupid headlines. That's a scientific term. I'm going to talk you through a few of them. Saudi Arabia's newest citizen is a robot. That's the Sophia robot by Hanson. Very nice piece of engineering. Has a fairly human-like appearance. And the automation part of the face, the motors and so on, give it quite plausible facial expressions. So the face is very engaging. Watch an interview in quotes here that people do with it, and you'll see how the interviewer is sucked into this illusion that it's actually a real person. Of course, it's not a real person. It's not even particularly autonomous as robots go. I suspect that its appearances are mostly teleoperated because it's very difficult to drive a complex face like that in a plausible way during a conversation. We know that conversations using a chatbot, which is what it's got, don't work very well for very long. And I think some of it has also been pre-scripted. Saudi Arabia, as promotion for Saudi Arabia, decided to make it a citizen entirely against their own citizenship laws. And probably all those hundreds of thousands of people, mainly from the Indian subcontinent, who work there and have done for years and don't have citizenship, were probably a little bit knocked by this. So a robot gets it, but they don't. But it's a thoroughly delusionary advert. It's not a person. It's not a citizen. It's all marketing. Well, here's another one. I can't read this because it's underneath all the stuff on the screen that Zoom has put up there, I'm afraid. But it's to do with ADAR. You can read it yourself. So ADAR, I wrote a short piece on Medium about this one because I got so irritated by the hype. ADAR has an AI painting program. Now, this is work that goes back at least 30 years. I remember Harold Cohen, who's now dead, demonstrating painting programs about 30 years ago. Very nice work. What you can do is attach a painting program to a robot arm, generate a painting, and then at least have it draw things. Robot arm can draw reasonably well because the pencil has reasonably constant pressure. It's not very good at actual painting because the brush is a much more difficult thing to manipulate. And in fact, ADAR's paintings are drawings made by the painting program with the robot arm, which people have then coloured in. That's robot painting. In her own words, they stuck a human face on it. They've given it a chatbot. Oh yes, there's a very nice graphics program, which again has been developed, I think, about over the last 15 years, which can look at a photograph and using edge detection can input that into a drawing program and make a drawing of the photograph. So it has one of those as well. People think it's an artist. Of course, it's not an artist. It's not a person. It isn't creating pictures. There's the limit to the creativity of AI painting programs as well, although they're plausible, but they're not what you call great art. This one is very close to home. This was colleagues at Heriot-Watt working on a big EU project. And the idea of the project was to create a robot that would work in big shopping malls. A test site was actually in Finland, and would give people information about the mall and which shops there were and where they could buy things, and do a little bit of joking and chatting along the way. So it'd be a nice interface. Tricky application for a conversation system. Lots of noise in there. Groups of people come up, talking all at once, not standing in the right place. I would say there's also the problem of the robot being attacked by shoppers, but this was not involved in this particular headline. So my colleagues in Heriot-Watt doing the conversation system, and they are world leaders incidentally in conversation systems, decided to do a 1-week study in a small shopping chain in Edinburgh. They put the robot in the shopping train. They had it in one spot for health and safety reasons. They were collecting responses. They were trying out their conversation system, knowing that this is quite a difficult application. After 1 week, the study finished. Yes, the conversation system hadn't been perfect. The customers would have preferred something which would actually take them to where the stuff in the shop was on the shelves. I think that's understandable actually in the situation. And they found it a little bit confusing as a result, although generally the people who worked in the shop enjoyed having it there and were sorry when it went. So they talked to the BBC about their study. It was part of the BBC series on robot applications. And the BBC came out with this headline, which somebody must have enjoyed writing. Unfortunately, it was so catchy, it went around the world. God knows which publications picked it up, dozens and dozens of them, because it was so interesting. And the other partners in the consortium were so cross, and in particular SoftBank, whose Robotic was so cross, they were told that they could not speak to the BBC again. So there's a headline. Here's another one. This was in the UK. First evidence to Parliament and is said to behave better than ministers. So what happened here is that a university that shall remain nameless in the south of England decided to record the answers to 4 specific questions in this parliamentary inquiry. So these were recorded responses. They then took the robot to Parliament, stuck it in front of the committee. The committee asked the 4 questions. The robot gave the recorded responses. An MP3 player could do as well. In point of fact, it really was an MP3 player doing this, you might say, because it was just a sound recording, a digital sound recording. As for performing better than ministers, that may have been because they were actual answers to the questions, where ministers are inclined to wander around and not answer the questions. But again, thoroughly misleading. This is not evidence, and this is not a human interaction. Microsoft sacks journalists. Now, this one gives you a kind of confusion which is very, very widespread out there. Now, this story is about Microsoft looking at its online news service and deciding that it could possibly replace the journalists who write the online news service with an AI summarization program that would extract the news from the different sources like Reuters and others, produce a summary and stuff it in the Microsoft online news. Nothing to do with robots at all. No robot was involved in this story. But that confusion between software and a robot is absolutely everywhere, and is one of the reasons for the robots will take over the world sensationalism, because people are actually identifying things as robots that aren't robots. And this one, this is a piece of what I call hubris. Deploy self-driving cars in London by 2021. Well, you'll be relieved to hear, certainly if you live in London, that no, they are not deploying self-driving cars right now. And this is because we've seen that self-driving cars are a lot harder than the hype suggested. And a lot of companies, even tech companies, would buy the hype and thought that this was an easy thing to do. Of course, for reasons that roboticists will fully understand. It actually isn't, mainly because, of course, a factory organized around a robot is not like a city, which is not organized around self-driving cars. So we get lots of these headlines, and each time you get these headlines, this increases people's fears and people's inflated expectations about the capacity of robots. So it isn't terribly surprising that people come out with ideas like this one. So apart from taking over the world, this is the robots will take all your jobs thing, which goes along with it. I forget which magazine this was taken from. I think it might have been the front page of Time or something like that. Nice cartoon. And it represents this idea that robots will just universally remove human jobs. So 20 million jobs by 2030, replace some huge proportion in 15 years, 43 jobs will soon be lost to automation. The second and third headlines are actually a bit more accurate, at least about what they're talking about, which is automation. The first headline is robots could take over 20 million jobs, not talking about robots mostly. Actually, the paper I referenced, which is a piece by Rodney Brooks about the 7 deadly sins of AI hype, is very good on the issue of jobs, because he points out that, in fact, people are wildly extrapolating from niche capabilities that robots are quite currently capable of into whole occupations. So because a robot can cut grass, it doesn't mean that in 15 years you'll have robot grounds people, because grounds people do all kinds of things other than cut the grass. Because you have a robot vacuum cleaner, it doesn't mean that cleaning jobs will all be replaced by robots. In fact, I think that's really rather unlikely for reasons I might come to. Automation, of course, is a different thing, and what they're mainly talking about is the internet here. So they're looking at what I would call some higher clerical jobs, and these are things like travel agents, to some extent estate agents, insurance quotes, the middle people in between services and customers, who previously would have distributed the customers around the services. The internet can now do that better. So yes, those jobs are being automated quite fast, but because the internet is taking those jobs, not because it's anything at all to do with robots. I would personally be amazed if there were many jobs that robots would take over in the next 5 years, other than in manufacturing. And in manufacturing, we know that the cost of installing robots is actually primarily the cost of configuring the factory. It's been reckoned that maybe 90% of the cost of putting in robot arms is down to building the factory in which they can work without too much problem. This is why in Europe, you're not seeing a huge increase in the use of robots in manufacturing. In Asia, the growth is phenomenal. And the reason it's phenomenal is that in Asia, people are building new factories, and they're building new factories for robots from the very beginning, where in Europe in particular, you've got existing factories, and converting them for robots is very expensive and isn't always worth it. And it's true that we're looking at new manufacturing robots like cobots, which would be more responsive and would allow people to work alongside robots. But again, this won't actually remove people. It will change their jobs, but it won't actually remove their jobs, I think. I'll come back to that if anyone wants me to during questions. Okay, there's a long history here. And one of the reasons why people like to believe this stuff is to do with that long history. So what's this picture I've just put up? Okay, well, this is a Greek myth, the myth of Pygmalion, the guy in the red cloak, and his statue, often called Galatea, statue on a plinth there. So Pygmalion fell in love. I think love might be the wrong word here. I think he lusted after his statue, to be honest, if you read the story. And he liked it so much, he asked Aphrodite, who's the person in the middle with all the floaty drapery, to infuse her with life. And this being a story, of course, she comes to life. And Cupid is floating around on the right-hand side of the diagram because he's going to shoot his arrow into the poor woman so that she falls in love with Pygmalion, who incidentally was a complete creep and a misogynist. So she was unfortunate. She'd probably been better off not being brought to life. You could say, and we do say in the book, this is an early sex bot, in fact, more of an android than an actual robot. But sex is definitely the topic here. So you've got sexy robots. Also in myth, and again, the Greeks, this is Talos. You may have seen this in, I don't think Jason and the Argonauts, this may have appeared in. Talos was created by Daedalus, who was a fictional, possibly, maybe semi-fictional inventor who worked in Crete for King Minos. Anyway, the story, he was the one whose son Icarus flew too near the sun and dropped into the sea when the wax melted on his wings. So Daedalus was a great inventor. And the story goes that when Zeus, the Greek king of the gods, impregnated Europa in the form of a white bull, impregnated is, again, we're into more sex here, you might say a euphemism for what went on there. He stuck her on Crete, and this great robot, which is pretty much a robot, it was a metal man, would walk around the island and stop anyone getting close to her, presumably someone who might want to rescue her. So you've got sex on the one hand, you've got strength on the other, and those two themes come all the way down from, 3,000 years ago or more. So our culture contains all this. And then we start being able to build some of these things. This is medieval clock, it's the Munich one. So when clockwork was invented, immediately people start going, oh, we could build some of these little figures, couldn't we? Here are the ones that move around on the clock. And once clockwork gets slightly better, people start producing in the 18th century what are called automata. This is a particularly nice automata. It's in Switzerland. I forget the guy's name, something like Yaki Drost. This one is called the Writer. On the left, you see how it appears, and on the right, you see some of the mechanism. It's a very complex mechanism. Now, you may say that figures on clocks really aren't robots, are they? They're just clockworky things that do the same thing every time, much like industrial robots, I might say. The Writer is one of the first programmable automata. Not very programmable. It had a set of 40 switches, and you could input 40 characters using this switch, and it would write them. So it could write any 40 character phrase that you import. So it was kind of programmable within the limit of 40 alphabetic characters anyway. So a very nice piece of work. Now, the interesting thing is that people are not scared of any of these things. They don't think they're going to take over the world, and they don't think that they're going to lose their jobs to them either. So what produced this change? Well, we also have a history, and this goes back again a long way, of thinking that technology might get out of hand. Now, what you see here is the Prague story, in which a clay figure, the golem of Prague, is brought to life by having the word of God written on its forehead to defend the Jewish community. You can see it wasn't a tiny clay figure, it's quite a big hulking one, with cracks mended by bits of metal, a little bit like Frankenstein's monster in many ways, a parallel story. And again, just like Frankenstein's monster, this one got out of control, and the rabbi who brought it to life by putting the word of God on its face had to take the word off again in order to stop it from wreaking havoc. The idea of doing something which challenges the gods, again, goes back to the ancient Greeks. As I said, they called that hubris. I've already used the word once. Hubris was always followed by nemesis, when the gods struck back. In other words, it all went wrong. Now, in some ways, since Christianity is pretty much a Greek version of Judaism, this idea certainly went into Christianity. Our God is a jealous God. And the sin of pride was very much used to attack science in medieval times. Again, the idea was that science was setting up humans to be like God, to challenge God. So I think this is the thread that comes down to us with our theory of technology in particular, that somehow by doing this kind of thing, you're challenging the gods and it's all going to go wrong. Frankenstein's monster brought to life by electricity. There's a theme here, incidentally. There's always something bringing these things to life. It's Aphrodite, it's the word of God, it's electricity. These days, it's AI. That actually has the same magic role at animating a robot as electricity did Frankenstein's monster. And here's one that was just magic. I think that's perhaps a bit more literal. This is the Sorcerer's Apprentice with Mickey Mouse in one of Disney's cartoons, where he produces an army of broom robots. And of course, they get out of hand, they reproduce, and soon he's knee deep in water. And again, the sorcerer has to turn up to get him out of it. So this technology fear is very, very pervasive in Western society. So I think that's what you're seeing. The book would argue that it's about us. It's not actually about the technology itself. You get things like this. This is a quote from Samuel Butler, who wrote a book called Erewhon, which is short for nowhere. He's a philosopher of the 19th century in the UK. Now, he isn't referring to the robots here. He's talking about the machines. So here's another thread coming into this. The Industrial Revolution in Western Europe, and this is certainly true in the UK, was the most appalling experience for the mass of the population. Occupations were destroyed over very short periods. People were turfed out of stable rural settings. They were pushed into cities, into dangerous and overcrowded accommodation. They were prone to diseases. They worked in factories that were very dangerous and which involved children and women in repetitive tasks, which went on for hours and hours and hours at the mercy of the machines that they were looking after. Now, that experience has certainly dropped into our culture very, very deep indeed. And it's no wonder that people have their doubts about automation and what's going to happen as a result of it. And all this appears in Rossum's Universal Robots. As you probably know, the word robot comes from this, and it has all of those themes. The first time robot is really used, and you've got, in this case, they're androids because they're actually developed biologically. You've got an army of them. They're cheap. You don't pay them wages. They take everybody's jobs. In the end, they take over all the things. The humans die out in wars and things. Eventually, the robots learn to reproduce, and there you are, a new civilization. There's very much a theme in here of Darwinism, incidentally, social Darwinism, and that misinterpretation of the survival of the fittest, that a superior species will come about and drive us all into extinction, although with climate change, we may be doing that job quite nicely for ourselves, actually. And I think the other thing that runs alongside this is our own experience of enslavement, because we have very recent experiences of mass enslavement. America's not the only place. Brazil, the whole enslavement of Africans, which involved millions and millions of people, also involved, of course, slave revolts. Wouldn't you revolt if you were a slave if you could? So the experience of enslaving people and having them revolt is one that's very recent in our history. So there you are. That's, I think, a lot of the causes of this. And then final thread, anthropomorphization. Now, that is a poster I've seen by printers and I've seen by photocopiers. What's happening here? The machine has been anthropomorphized. It's been turned into a human thing, and it's been given malicious intent. So here's the technology biting back, even if in only very simple ways. Anthropomorphization, and I'm coming to us now as researchers, is close to our heart, isn't it? Because, hey, that's what we work with. It's certainly a very powerful impulse. If you look at advertising, you'll see that advertising uses anthropomorphization extensively because it taps so deeply into our psyches. And this is because we have this theory of mind, which we apply to everything, including printers, apparently. So there's the definition of anthropomorphization, attributing human characteristics onto things that don't how human character
Hi everyone. Maybe Ruth's signal or Wi-Fi was a bit.
Hi guys. At what point did you lose me?
Wi-Fi. I heard Wi-Fi last.
Which slide was I on?
The printer.
Okay, good. That wasn't very long ago. Good. I'll go back to that one. Well, just a minute. I was afraid that might happen. Can you see that one? No, you can't. I haven't shared the screen. Hang on a minute. Let's go back and share the screen again. Sorry about this. Technology is a wonderful thing. Fine. Technology is a wonderful thing when it works. Okay, you should have the screen shared again. Now, okay. There we are, back with the printer.
Great. And if you want to take more 5 minutes, Ruth, and then go to the Q&A, that's also perfect.
Yeah, okay, I've nearly finished. I've nearly got to the end of the talk. So, anthropomorphization, I was about to say, that's what we're doing. Yes, we attribute human characteristics to all kinds of things, machines, pets, and God knows what. But as researchers, we are working with anthropomorphization. So I think the point I was about to arrive at is, hey guys, aren't we guilty of actually reinforcing people's illusions about robots in what we do? I think there's an ethical issue there. So then you get headlines like this: do robots deserve human rights? How to build a moral robot? I sometimes ask whether you would apply these headlines to washing machines, because robots aren't that different from washing machines. How about a moral washing machine, or a washing machine that has rights? Okay, why is it important? Because by doing this, we are absolving human responsibility. The computer says no. It's not our fault, it's the computer's fault. It means that we're allowing robots, as machines are traditionally done, to dictate how people will work alongside them. And finally, we get to things like autonomous weapons. So these illusions are very serious. The autonomous weapons one is because the military think that robots are wonderful, and actually also because killing people is very easy. So if your robot malfunctions but still manages to kill people, well, it's kind of fine, isn't it? The things we try to get robots to do are much more difficult than that. So I recommend that organisation and to follow their campaign, because this is a live topic. You think of a drone flying around a city, able to target people from a database of people we don't like, faces, do fallible facial recognition, sees a face, kills it. What could go wrong? Okay, conclusion. Robot hype is still in full swing. I'm afraid it will die down eventually. There's massive confusion with the internet and software. People are culturally predisposed to inaccurate anthropomorphization and to the takeover of the world fears. And we are, in some cases, colluding with or even encouraging some of these misconceptions. So I would suggest that as researchers, we have an ethical imperative to combat this sort of thing. That's why we wrote the book. But all of you guys can do that in a small way as well, by engaging, by making sure that when you engage with the public, you engage in an ethical way so that they understand what the technology really does. Okay, sorry to have exceeded my time, and away we go.
Thank you so much, Ruth. This was an amazing talk. You did not exceed your time. You were perfect, actually. And I would like to take a moment to thank Ruth for the talk. and now officially open the Q&A part. So if you want to ask a question, you can do that by just raising the hand and talking, or just unmuting yourself. Also, you can open your videos. I see Glenda's hand up, so Glenda, go ahead.
Yes. Okay, can you hear me? Yes, okay. So thanks a lot, Ruth, for the talk. It's interesting, and unfortunately, I have not had a chance to read the book. So I'm sure there are much more details and much more accounts of all the different interesting perspectives that you brought together in this book. So my question might simply be from this fact that I haven't got all the details still. But I was a bit interested in the point you made about this kind of God complex. So you mentioned this could be one of the reasons why people might have this issue with this artificial being, and which we now call robots, or refer to as robots, as one of these kind of triggers. So that in a sense, it says more about us as people, or their mirror kind of, or self-perception, rather than actually the technology. And I think from my own research, I definitely like to make this differentiation between robots as cultural objects versus actually technological systems, which I think that also in the humanities, where I am myself a researcher as well, is quite clear that these are two very different strands. And then I think that this God complex issue is maybe more a reflection of some of the various narratives that are brought up in these kind of thought experiments when we treat them as cultural objects. But you can also say that these maybe divide more into general categories of utopian and dystopian narratives. And of course, in HRI, where there's also a technological development, the focus might be more on the utopian narratives. There might be some motivation to bring robots into people's life, also inspired from sci-fi movies and so on. And in this sense, this can also create this kind of capability gap that has been discussed in the field, where basically there is this mismatch between what people expect and what the robot can actually do. A bit of contextualization for my question, sorry about that, it's a bit long. So my question is mainly about, it was a bit unclear for me right now, who is really responsible, because you brought up a lot of these media headlines and talking also about people's wrongly anthropomorphizing robots. But I'm curious what role HI researchers and roboticists have in this, and is the fight here maybe between these three groups and not just two? Like, is it the media that has to take more responsibility? Do HI researchers have to be more engaged in this discussion of public perception? Or is it a matter of people just believing too much in what the media presents and are not critical? So maybe you can just again say a bit about what exactly is that message, and how does that align in this idea that we actually are in a sense co-shaping this kind of idea or vision for robotics?
Yes, okay. Well, the bottom line is that most people have never engaged with a robot at all. So I contrast robots of the imagination with real robots. They have robots of the imagination. Film plays at least as much of a role in this as the press headlines do. But they have no real experience of actual robots, unless possibly vacuum cleaner robots. They may have seen grass cutter robots, they may have seen robot toys, but these are real robots, and they probably don't think of them as being the same as robots of the imagination. I don't think it's any good saying who's responsible in some sense, because when you get hype, everybody is responsible. Hype is a human social construct which self-reinforces for a long period, like a lot of human activity. So you can say the same with, I don't know, buying shares. The shares get hyped, everyone buys the shares, they can never go down, and at some point they crash. It's the same process, exactly the same process of bandwagon jumping. Yeah, the press do it. No newspaper ever lost sales by saying robots would take over the world, because people like that story. So you can exploit it if you want to sell things. You could exploit it if you want to be a commentator. You can ride the wave and add to the delicious shivers of fear that people feel. I think people quite like being scared of robots often, because it's not like they're going to look out the window and see them marching down the street. It is robots of the imagination, a bit like zombies, really, very similar to zombies in some ways. On the other hand, we live in a society in which things are getting very flaky in many ways. Do you see this? I see this. We have climate change, we have populist regimes, we have the growth of reactionary politics, and people feel scared. And then they project their anxieties onto things they see around them. And robots are just another thing you can project your anxiety onto. So these are complex social processes. The book spends a long time, most of it, I mean, I gave you about chapter 1 there. The book spends most of its time talking about what robots can actually do and how they work, in the hope that if people read that, they get to understand things a bit more realistically. It's a hope, okay? Doesn't mean that's what will happen. The point of this talk is that you've all got a responsibility to do this, in my view, not just me, okay? In your small way, because all we can do is to try to be responsible. But there's something inherent in HRI, which, if we're not careful, makes us collude in it. Are we trying to make robots more human-like? You bet we are. Of course we are. Are we drawing on people's illusions about anthropomorphism? Yeah, you bet we are. We're trying to make our robots people to them, but they're not people, they're machines. Yeah, so I guess what I'm saying to you is, first, there's an ethical imperative to be upfront with people, and secondly, I think we need to think about what we're doing in HRI, because I think the way we're doing it maybe is making things worse.
Thank you, Ruth. Michael has his hands raised, and then there is another question in the chat I can go through.
Thank you so much for the talk. It was great. I really enjoyed lots of the things that you brought up. I've not read the book, but the things with like Pygmalion and RUR and Frankenstein really resonated with me. But I think what resonated with me more was when you had mentioned how factories in the East, like in Asia, are designing their factories for robots, unlike in the West, where we would have to retrofit existing factories and processes. And that brings to the mind this idea I've had for a while, that we're really just lagging behind the East. Like everything that they've gone through, we are just starting to do. So like say in Japan, they have vending machines for ordering food, and now that's just coming here with touchscreens, but they've had it for a long time. And same with robots, where Japan has been known for leading robots. And I was wondering what your opinions on what kind of lessons we can learn from looking eastward, or if you think that that should be more important. Another point that I want to bring up is like the whole technology getting out of hand thing. I think Godzilla is a good representation of like the fears of nuclear technology, and on that thread of nuclear technology getting out of hand in the West, we like say John Oppenheimer, the people who worked on the atomic bomb, they were very regretful for it. Do you think that we're heading into say a John Oppenheimer or regretful scientists for robotics?
Okay, well, there's a number of questions there. Japan doesn't have the same cultural background. So the Frankenstein complex I talked about doesn't really exist in the same way in Japan, as far as I know. Their culture doesn't have that hubris nemesis idea in it, and robots are not viewed the same in Japan as they are viewed in the West. Moreover, their industrial development's much more recent and has been more of a positive experience in Japan on the whole, because it was done in a more controlled way than it was in a lot of European countries, where it definitely wasn't a positive experience. So I think there are more positive attitudes to technology and to automation in Japan as well. You can't just wave a wand and change cultures, though. It doesn't work. So in sense of what would we learn from Japan, I don't think you can just look at Japan and say, oh, well, we'll learn this and do this. We have our own dynamics in different countries, and you have to work with the dynamics you've got. I've forgotten what the other question was.
It was for
Repeat your
like say
second
the
question.
regretful.
Oh, the regretful scientist.
Right.
The regretful scientist. No, I wouldn't say so. So the bomb could not have been built without the fundamental physics that lay behind it. So the nuclear scientists have developed the fundamental physics. There isn't a fundamental science behind robotics in the same way that we can then exploit. That's kind of our problem. We're trying to do something highly integrated that's very difficult, much more difficult than people outside the field really understand. And I don't think there is one thing which will suddenly make robotics easy and then we'll regret it. I've had this discussion with other people. So we've had what I call big changes. So SLAM, simultaneous location and mapping, big step forward in navigation, big step forward in navigation. Has it suddenly made robotics easy? No, it hasn't. Okay, it's allowed us to take a few baby steps forward. Better walking technology, and I'm going to mention Boston Dynamics here, which is also in the chat. Boston Dynamics guy's name. Anyway, he worked for MIT, then he set up Boston Dynamics. He did the pogoing robot, which is in the Boston Computer Museum, very nice piece of kit, because people suddenly realized that walking was bouncing and that walking wasn't necessarily driven from the brain, but by a pattern generator in the bottom of the spine in most animals. And that made walking suddenly a lot more efficient than robots. Does that mean you see walking robots everywhere? No, it doesn't, because there are still huge problems with balance and also power consumption, because walking's very expensive. So no, it doesn't. In some ways, it can make the problem worse because we can walk faster, that takes more power. Boston Dynamics are very guilty of contributing to the hype, incidentally. Their engineering is magnificent. So, you know, take it. I'm sure we all know that if you've seen their things. Engineering is magnificent. Their videos are incredibly deceptive, okay? So people saw the dancing robot last Christmas, their biped, and went, oh God, they've solved all the problems. It's dancing, it can do anything. I don't know how many takes that one took, but I bet it was more than one, okay? It's also not clear if it's being teleoperated. Many of their videos are teleoperated, and it's also not clear how much was pre-scripted. But if you take all those things in combination, no, they have not solved the problem of bipeds. But they can do some pretty cool demonstrations because the walking has improved. So that's what happens. Yeah, we make a step forward and we can do better. But these are not giant transformative leaps that suddenly allow robotics to take off. They're incremental progress and useful and worthwhile and allow us to do things in niches we couldn't do things in before, but they're not a general purpose intelligent robot or anything like that. So yes, some people are indeed making things worse, and Boston Dynamics do, I'm afraid, in spite of their excellent engineering.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. We have time for one quick question, if there is any. Okay.
I think Philippa had the question in the chat.
Yeah, I think Ruth kind of addressed it, which I so much appreciate in terms of the progress and if is that faster now. I guess I also wanted to ask Ruth a question. So I really appreciated your talk. It was really interesting to go back to the classics and experience how our mindset just is put into a way of thinking just because of our cultural context. So I really appreciate that. And I like classics a lot, so I think we should bring them more into these discussions. I would like to ask you, Ruth, if you had to give an advice of a student that is just starting now in robotics in HRI, what would be the top advice you would give to that student?
Be patient, I think, because you're not going to revolutionize the field. Pick on some interesting aspect of robotics, and in particular, think of good things you could do with it, a nice niche in which you could work. So it's important with robots to think of a good application domain where you can actually make a real contribution. And I give you the Paro. I'm sure most people have heard of the Paro seal robot. Now, I remember that work starting about 20 years ago, okay? a Japanese researcher who wanted to produce a robot that would help elderly people with dementia by giving them more interaction than they were getting from people around them. Because when someone has dementia, they get very repetitive, and other humans find that frustrating, and they don't like to interact because it's driving them crazy. So people with dementia never get enough interaction, and it makes them frustrated, but they find it hard to express that. So the idea of the Paro is simple. It's a seal-like robot. Seals are not things people interact with every day, so the fact that it's not a proper seal isn't a problem. B, they do not have legs and tails and other difficult bits of anatomy like cats and dogs. So you can have a simple behavior like wriggling, a nice furry exterior, big eyes, some capabilities for recognizing voices and following faces, and you have something which actually people with dementia really enjoy interacting with, and which has been clinically proven to actually help as well, make people less restless and less stressed. So that's a brilliant application. It took him 20 years to do that. Okay, it's now in use. And incidentally, things like, is the fur washable, turn out to be at least as much of a problem as how intelligent is it in a domain like that. So what you want as a new researcher is that kind of inspiration, I think. Think of a domain in which a robot could do something useful with the sorts of capabilities that are plausible at the moment. So, don't try to produce another human clone robot. It ain't going to work. It's not a good idea. And you'll just end up frustrated and cross and not having achieved that much. Look at the Paro, do something like that. Find a niche, find something useful, find something we can do and make a contribution there.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's great that you brought up Paro, because I learned that it was also FDA approved. So it's actually a medical device. So that's very good. Yeah. So I just want to take a moment for everyone to thank Ruth for being here and sharing so much knowledge with us today. Thank you so much, Ruth. We really appreciate your time and being here. And I will just quickly close the session. So next week, we'll have Ilaria Torre from KTH presenting about investigating and communicating motivation in social robot navigation. So it's going to be next week, and I hope to see you there. And we want to thank again our sponsors, Animatas and Semio, for supporting our infrastructure. Thank you so much, everyone, and I hope to see you next week.